Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Web and Mobile Systems lecture at Oakland University. So in the last lecture, we had started discussing the setup of a React app. So essentially, we had started our discussion regarding the React.js library, which is a front-end development framework that kind of simplifies the process, not simplifies, but makes the process more efficient in terms of developing more robust front-end frameworks, right? So essentially, where React helps us is that instead of relying on different technologies to develop your front-end framework, such as developing the foundational structure using HTML and then styling it with CSS, and then applying interactive aspects and dynamic aspects into your front-end UI using vanilla JS. What React.js library provides us with is basically this language that we call as JavaScript XML, or JSX in short, and then the entirety of the development is kind of taken or done using that particular language, right? So we don't rely heavily on HTML in order to develop our DOM structure. We use JSX to create what is known as the React DOM. And then with the help of other third-party packages, which we call as transpilers in the form of Babel and Webpack, it basically translates the JSX syntax that we use to write HTML-like code, and then helps the browser to understand that and then render the different components that we have developed using React on our web browser. Okay, so this kind of gives us two different advantages. So specifically, this makes our front-end development process basically what we call as is reusable. Okay, so that means we can write a particular component, and then depending on different parameters that we pass to that particular component, we can reuse that component in different locations in our page, right? So the examples that we used, the practical examples that we used in order to understand this process is by taking a look at different websites, e-commerce websites such as Amazon.com. And then we also took some examples from Airbnb. And then these kind of examples can be found across all of the different day-to-day websites that we find in the form of, let's say, Shopify or Spotify, and then you have your youtube.com. So all of these different interfaces kind of follow these design patterns, which outlines the benefits of using a front-end framework, right, React.js, compared to developing your website using plain JavaScript and stuff like that, right? So in addition to being reusable, what makes React reusable is the other benefit that it has, which is what we call as the React.js development codes being composable. So essentially what we do is that we don't write an entire web browser in a serial fashion. It's not necessary for us to write from the very beginning to the very end within the body tags of our HTML file to develop the different aspects of our web interface. We can just develop this as separate different components, and then we can bring those components together in order to develop our final website, right? So in this process, in order to kind of set up your React.js project inside Visual Studio Code, what is necessary for us to, of course, have the NPM package manager. So this is basically a prerequisite that is necessary to set up our React.js environment. And then the code that is used to essentially install or set up the project directory, which has the React.js library present within it, is to basically run what we call as npx, which is to install and then compile the packages that we are trying to essentially implement in our project directory. And then the command directive that we have is create React app, and then we provide it with the app name, right? So the directory structure that we worked on previously was the demo2. Inside demo2, we had installed this project structure for my app, which was a sample name that we gave to our sample directory for the Hello World application. And then inside of node modules, all of the different packages that are involved will be installed through this particular command. And then that will be followed up with two different subdirectories. One is the public subdirectory, which is what will be shown to the world. And then we have the source directory, where we will keep all of our main source file. In addition to that, this command also enables the execution of the package.json file, which essentially has the information of our project directory setup, and then any other additional third-party packages that you may install along with this particular project. So for example, let's say you would also like to use Tailwind CSS, which is a third-party package, alongside React.js. So if you plan to do that, and if you install that, then package.json file will essentially be responsible for tracking those dependencies for your project. And later on, if you move your project to some other platform other than your local computer where you're coding, then once you execute the initialization of the package.json file, you will have installed all the different third-party packages as well that are dependencies for your project folder. So essentially, that is what the purpose of having this package.json file is, right? It also gives us with a git ignore file. So in case, not in case, but when we do initialize this particular project directory with git, that gives us the capability to kind of avoid the files that we want to send to GitHub, or basically the files that are involved in our project directory that we do not want to be pushed to the cloud platform for backup purposes or sharing it with others and stuff like that. So some of the important files that are there. So in the public directory, the main file that we have is basically any kind of media file that you want to be that needs to be shared with the public if you want to share it. So here we can see that the basic or the default setup that has been given to us when we executed this particular command is in the form of different logo files. It consists of a favicon icon or a favorite icon file. And then the main portion here is the index.html file. So the first file, so important files, if you put it this way, is basically within the public subdirectory. We have the first important file, or basically the landing page of our entire project, which is the index.html file. Okay, so the index.html file, the main thing is, of course, you will have all of the pieces of metadata information within the head tag, as we are used to working with within the HTML file. So this will involve linking your main script file, okay? Since we are within the JavaScript environment at the end of the day, even though React.js is a library of JavaScript, we are essentially required to link up the main script file of the landing page of our React.js project with this HTML file. So all of that information, along with any other metadata information that you would like to specify for your project, will be specified within this index.html file, which is present in the public subdirectory. But after that, after the metadata information, you will have the main body of your HTML file, right? And the body is basically where we have learned that we put all of the subjective coding aspects or the coding structures that is relevant to the development of the front-end UI that we are trying to do, right? So this body, there will be a little bit difference and will start to kind of differ here from the previous projects that we have done, will only consist of a single div element. Okay, and this is what we call as the root element of the entire project. And this div element in the DOM structure, and once it is translated to the actual DOM structure from the React DOM structure, will be called as the root element, right? So that is the reason why we are calling it the root element of the entire project directory. So if we take a look at what we have here in the initial setup, we can see here that in the body section, if we kind of maximize the head section, you can see all of the different metadata information that is present here. And you can also see that there should be a script file somewhere that is kind of tagging up the HTML file, right? So, but if you pay attention to the body itself, which is the subjective information that you're trying to insert with respect to the development, you can see here that there is a single div, and that has been given an ID attribute of root. And this inside of this particular div is where, once the compilation of the React project is done, we will be putting all of our elements, different JSX elements, into this area, right, as a child to this parent div element. So this is known as the root div element. So whenever you start a fresh React.js project, we can kind of, if we try to look into the important design criteria of the fundamental steps that you have to carry out in order to set up your project, this is one of the very first steps. So I can put step 1 here with respect to the fact that you have a body in your index.html file, and that body will consist of a single div element for the entire project, right? So that is the first step that you have to undertake. Once that is done, the second step is to pay attention to the other main files that is present in your source folder. So this is going to be inside SRC. And the two important files that will be there inside your SRC is basically in the form of your landing page for your React.js project that will be identified by this index.js file that we have here. And then in addition to that, we also have, for more complex projects, right? If it's a very simplistic project, then you can kind of get away with not having to further decompose your project components. But let's say if your project has different elements or different subsections on the web page itself. So let's say there is one portion which is kind of dedicated to the navigation bar of your interface. Then you have a left vertical menu that gives further information about some characteristics about of the project that you're kind of developing. And then you have the main body, which gives information with respect to the main content of the page that is being currently displayed. So those are all different components, right? Those are all different subsections within the UI that you are displaying to your user, right? So essentially the ideology, the design ideology of a React.js project is that you don't want to do that same sequential fashion development as you did with HTML, where you put the entirety of your interface as a sequential code, one after the other, irrespective of the context of the components or the elements that you have on your web page, right? So we saw that when we developed the navbar project or the portfolio project. We just put everything one after the other as it needs to be displayed on the web page, and then we applied styling here, right? But React doesn't follow that design criteria. As we discussed, that one of the main motivations of React is for the code to be composable. That is, it is composed of different functional components, right? So we can elaborate on this, and we can say that it is composed of different functional components. And when we say functional components, we mean the components that kind of dispense or provide different functionality on the web page. So to elaborate on that, the navigation bar provides a specific functionality on the web page, right? If you have a search filter area, like we saw for our Amazon search results, then that provides a specific functionality. Then when you see the results being returned on the Amazon's interface as card components, those are a separate functionality, right? So when you design your project, you have to kind of create a separate file for each of these different components, and then you have to make a function call, so to speak, and then bring them all together. So index.js is basically the main setup of your functional components. That's where you will call the functional components, that's where you will create what we call as the root element of your React DOM, right? So that is the purpose of your index.js file, right? The very first and the second important file that you have there, which is essentially the main functional component of your entire project, we call that as the app.js. So sometimes you will find some codes kind of exclude this app.js and treat the index.js itself as similar to app.js as the primary functional component. And then what they do essentially is that within this SRC folder, so this we can say as a separate step, is that you create another subdirectory within SRC that we will call as components. Okay, and within this components is where you will create specific functional components or different sub-functional components that will be different pieces of functionality on your web page. So here I can create something like the navbar.js. In addition to that, I can create something like the search filter or search filter.js and things like that. And when I need to bring all of these together into as a single user interface design, then all I'm going to do is I'm going to call them as a function within the file that is basically aggregating all of these different composable components together in under a single view, right? But all the time you have to remember is that whenever you write a particular piece of component, right, it should return, since it's a function, it's written as a function, that return statement of that function should return only one primary parent element. That is one of the important requirements of designing using React.js that we will have to keep an eye out on, right? And we will talk more about that. If it's not clear, we will understand that through practice, we will get an idea of it, right? So these are some of the major files that you will be dealing with in React, and that is how we will be kind of setting up of our project, right? So here I will give a small comment here for you to kind of keep in mind. You can make a note of this. For now, if you're new to this, might as well memorize it until it becomes a habit. But essentially what you need to remember that each functional component must return a single parent element. Okay, so what we are kind of referring to that is that if you notice here, this is a functional component, right? Our app itself is a functional component. So when you declare the functional component, you write it as a function. So if we remember in JavaScript, if we are declaring a function, right, we use the keyword function followed by the name of the application or the name of the function that we're trying to declare. And one thing to note here is the name of all your functional components will start with a capital letter, okay? Because the reason why we are highlighting this is JavaScript is camel casing. So the first letter of each word or each phrase that you use, right, is small letter, and the immediate next phases is basically capitalized, right? But the only kind of difference here is that whenever you're declaring a functional component in React.js, for example, like this app.js, and if we declare any other functional components such as navbar or search filter or output form and those kind of things, then the very first letter also needs to be capitalized and the next letters will also remain capitalized. So here, that is the reason why you can see that you have the A capital in app.js, right? And this is how you declare as a function. You give the first brackets and then you have the curly brackets. Notice here, within the function, we have a return statement. And within this return statement is where you are going to write your JSX code, right? Or which is basically known as HTML-like code. So this is not JavaScript per se. This is JavaScript XML, and this is not HTML either, right? So this needs to be kind of transpiled into a code that the web browser can understand, because the web browser doesn't have the default capacity to understand what this code is all about, right? So that is why we have what we call as the React DOM package that does that setup. And then we have other third-party packages like Webpack and Babel that transforms that code into something that the browser can then understand, right? So that is something that you would also like to keep in mind. So here, if you notice that we have a header element, okay, then we have an image, we have a paragraph, and then we have an anchor tag and stuff like that, okay? So essentially what is necessary that when this code is returning something, it must return a single element. So if you think of it in terms of the code, this is what the code returns. So this is what I mean when I say that each functional component must return a single parent element, then this is what I mean by that. That is, in your return statement, you should have a container that wraps the entirety of the code that you have, the HTML-like code that you have. So this is something that is necessary, otherwise React will throw an error. So that means in addition to this div, let's say if I had another piece of code here, and I could have some sort of div here, and I have some other pieces of code. We have seen such kind of development in HTML, right? Where we have a container for a specific subsection, and then we have a container for another subsection. If I write the code like this, you can already see that it's giving me an error because it does not appreciate the fact that this return statement or this functional component is trying to return two parent elements, right? Not two parent elements, but we can say that one element and then a sibling of that element. So we cannot have any kind of sibling behavior present when it comes to the returning of various JSX elements from our functional components. So that is what you have to keep in mind, that you should always have a primary element that kind of wraps around the entirety of the code, and that each functional component's return statement only sends back or only returns one parent element. Okay, so that is the important thing that you have to keep in mind. Other than that, when you are writing the components itself, that is when you're writing the return statement where you have your actual code for rendering out the web page itself. So let us put this as 3. You have to declare the component as a function. Okay, so that's the first step that you have to keep in mind. Let's put some space here. All right, and then once you declare the component as a function, the return statement, inside return statement, so let us put it like this, inside return statement, code all the front end aspects using JSX syntax. Okay, and then once that is done, so this is the first step, second step, and then the third step is to have an export statement for the function declared in step 1. Okay, well, step 1 essentially means this particular step. And you can add a prerequisite statement here, and you can say that import all required packages for the relevant file that you are working with. All right, so that means if we kind of take this 4-step structure for every, so we can say here for each component file, we need to kind of carry out these 4 different steps. So you kind of import all of the different packages that you need. So it could be a package or it could be a file altogether. So here we can see that it is kind of importing a CSS file that is associated with this. And then it is importing this image file and saving it into this object that we have created for this particular file. And then we can use this object wherever we need to use this URL. We can essentially use this object, and then during the compilation process, it will be replaced by the actual file path of wherever this file is, right? Then the second step is to declare the component as a function. So that will be using JavaScript syntax again. So function, app, and then the curly braces, right? Within that, we will have a return statement, and the return statement is where we will write our actual code that will be rendered on the web browser. So whatever you want to show to the client, whatever operations that you want to do, that will be done inside this return statement. So when you are writing this particular code, you can, to a certain degree, like almost 90%, you can use HTML code, but it's not HTML. That is something that you have to be aware of. That's even though you see that you have div, header, paragraph tag, anchor tag, these are not actually fully HTML. These are actually what we call as JSX syntax. So that is something that you need to remember. So when you're writing this part, that is inside the return statement, write all of these code, right? So here you have to remember that this is JSX syntax, which is essentially referred to as HTML-like code. This is not purely HTML, okay? Any code, and inside of this particular body, any code wrapped in curly braces is JavaScript code. So that means if you see here, when we say image src, and then you can see here we have the curly braces and then logo. If you pay attention to line 9 here, then just this portion here, which is wrapped inside the curly braces, it's treated as JavaScript code and not JavaScript XML code, right? So essentially what will happen is that if you assign something, some variable, which is storing some kind of value, some variable or object, and then you just call it and use it with another assignment operator, then it acts as a variable assignment operation, right? So this is exactly what is happening here, is that we are taking this object, which stores this file path, and we are assigning that to this attribute, which is src, right? So that is what you have to keep in mind. The last thing that you have to keep in mind while you're writing JSX code is to be aware of, be careful not to use any reserved keywords from JavaScript. Okay, so what I mean by that is that if you recall in HTML, if you want to establish a class name, okay, or a class label to any particular element within the HTML, the attribute that we used to use was just class, right? So if we have to kind of declare a div element with a class name, so if we do something like this, right? So we used to write div class equals to, and then within the double quotes, we used to give it some test or whatever, some kind of label, right? But we cannot write it in this particular fashion within JSX, because class is a reserved keyword for JavaScript, right? So we cannot do that. So similarly, if you remember our discussions from HTML forms, there used to be an element called label for different HTML elements that does not have a descriptive text. So for example, if you have an input HTML element, and then the type is, let's say, text or something like this, right? This input element did not have a descriptive text that will be shown on the rendered web browser page, right? It will just show as a field that has some capability for the user to enter the text. So in order to provide that, in order to kind of provide a label or a description to such elements which does not have self-description, we used to use this label element, and then we used to use this attribute called for, and this for was directly tied up to an ID, right? A unique ID. So here I can say if this is test1, then I would have had to say that I'm creating a label for test1, and then in the body of that particular element is where I would provide the descriptive text in order to explain what that non-descriptive HTML element is all about, right? So if you notice here that you cannot use for attribute if you're using things like label in your React.js project, because as again, for is a reserved keyword for loops, right? So here it's actually for React DOM, it is known as HTML for and not for itself. And similarly, you cannot write class name. You cannot write class itself. You have to write class name as the attribute itself. So what you have to be careful is that to not use any kind of reserved keywords, which is there is quite a few, not too much, but sufficiently enough so that you don't step on those minefields when you're coding, right? So if you look at the React.js part 1 slides, I have listed the link in the documentation specifically pointing to the page, which kind of summarizes the different reserved keywords and the alternatives that you should use when you're coding your React project, right? And then of course, the final process is the export statement of your function, okay? So where you're just going to write export default and then the name of the function without the first brackets. Okay, that is something that you have to remember in terms of the syntax, right? But if your file has multiple functions for some reason, okay, or multiple objects for some reason that you're trying to export out, then it will no longer be export default. You have to specify exactly what you're trying to export. So you can just say export and then the name of the file or name of the function or the object that you're trying to export out of this particular file. Since in this situation that we are looking into, we only have one function. This is the only function that is there in this particular file. We can use the statement export default and then the name of the function itself. So that takes care of development of your different functional components that you will have. Okay, so after that, the fourth step will be to basically bring this together under a single root. So we can say the fourth important is we have to pay attention to what is happening in the index.js file. Okay, so the first step is to import required packages. And there are two packages specifically that needs to be imported. So here we can say import required packages and components. Custom components is what the name we use. Whenever you see the name custom components, it's basically to say user-defined components. So here we can say instead of custom, sometimes people might also say it as user-defined components, that is components that you have specifically defined, right? So app.js could become a custom component if I go ahead and change this boilerplate code that you see here. So that will essentially just change it. So coming to the index.js file, of course, you will import just like you would import in your components file any external packages that you might need. But there are two important packages that are going to be present regardless of what you do with your project. If you're coding in React.js, you will be using these particular package files, right? So the first one is basically the React package that you will need. And then the second one that you will need is basically the React DOM package, okay? And / if you want to kind of extend this, the client side of the React DOM package. So one kind of helps us, the first one kind of helps us, the transpiler, to understand the different React components that are being used. And the second one essentially gives support through the translation of the React JSX structure to the HTML structure that the web browser can understand and eventually show to users what you are trying to develop or design, right, in your front-end user interface. In addition to that, the next step is to create the root element, right? So what we do is so let us just put some additional information here that we want to create what we call as the React DOM root element. So remember at the very beginning, in the index.html file, we call that the only thing that will be there in the body element of the code is a single div element, which will become the root element of the entire project. Now, this is the HTML root element, yes, but in index.js, we need to create what is called the React DOM root element, and we will take this entire subtree and we will put it as a child inside this div element within the HTML, right? So that is basically the design structure that we are going to follow, right? So in order to create this root element, for now, you have to remember this piece of code that is there in line 9, okay? So that is important. And then the piece of code that is there in line 10 itself, which is basically a method of the React library, right? Or not the React library, sorry, the React DOM library, right? So if necessary, you can keep this somewhere for reference, and you will be following this structure all the time, because, and then what you do there is that you will be calling the app.js as a functional call, because it is exported now. And this is going to be the structure for most of your index.js file while you try to understand how you are working or how to work with React.js and stuff like that. So how we do it in order to create our React DOM root element is we call the object that basically stores the entire package of React DOM here. And then within that package, we have a method called create root, okay? We call that method, and that method takes a parameter which is basically an execution of the DOM API that we have learned in vanilla JavaScript. And that DOM API, using that, what we are doing is we are linking the div element, which is basically the parent, right? And we are bringing that into the object called root inside the index.js file, right? And then using that, we call another method of the React DOM library that is known as render, which will essentially enable, as the name suggests, rendering of your different functional components. And then you can exclude this line 11 and line 13 if you want to. That is not necessary in this particular step. So what you have to pay attention to basically is this line 12, which is the syntax for the functional call, right? So here you create the React DOM root element by connecting to the HTML root element in index.html file, okay? And then after that, you call the render method, and inside of that, you pass in the custom components you have designed. So here in this example, the custom component, all we have is basically the app.js, right? So you have to pay attention, remember the syntax for custom component call is basically these two arrows, okay? And then sometimes, or most actually, when you're doing a custom component call, it's a self-closing tag, and then you specify the name of your custom component. So remember this syntax. This syntax is essentially important. So to give you an example, let's say we have another custom component. For example, let's say navbar.js, and we want to call that navbar.js right after this app.js. So the way or the syntax that we will be using to call navbar.js in another file is basically like this. So we don't have the extension, we just have the name of the file. But before we can use this, right, before we can make this function call, so we call this as a custom component function call. Function calls in JSX, this is the syntax. So please remember this is important. But before you can do this, we essentially have to write an import statement at the top, or before you use the function component call. So you essentially have to say something like this. So import navbar from, and then there will be some file, and we will say navbar.js. So now once this has happened, and if the navbar.js is written in terms of the structure, exactly the way that app.js is written here, right? That is, we have a function declaration, return statement has JSX code, and then there is an export statement. So those are the three important things. Then if that is the situation, then we can essentially write this import statement, bring it inside this object, and then use this object as a function call. So essentially, when you write this import statement, what happens is that entire function that we have based on the export statement is kind of brought in or linked with this particular object. And then when you make the call to that object, that is replaced by the whole function body's return statement that essentially is stored inside that object, right? So that is the structure we have. But you have to keep in mind is that in this scenario, if we had to make multiple function calls, right? So for example, if we write down this code again, let's say we have root.render, and then within that render, we have our different function components call, right? Different functional component call. So right now we can see that we only have app.js. But if there was a situation where we had to, let's say, call navbar.js, okay, not .js, sorry, navbar, right? And let's say we have one more, and let's say we just make up some name, and we say results is another custom defined functional component. So if you had a situation like this will throw an error, right? And the reason why it will throw an error is that the return statement, so this is, we don't have a return statement per se, but rendering is something that is returning all of these different components to the browser, right? The browser needs to render. This is going to throw an error because it violates that rule that we talked about, that each component must return a single parent element. So when you have a situation like this, in order to protect yourself, what you have to do, or in order to avoid those errors, you essentially have to wrap this around a div element in order to make sure that you don't get the error. So in this way, the rendering aspect just renders a single parent element. So this structure must be ensured that every component within React.js must be returning a single parent element. We should not have multiple elements on the same level of the DOM at the very top. Okay, internally, you can have multiple elements on the same level, right? So here the div has 3 childs, and then this can have multiple childs if necessary within its own code and stuff like that. So that is allowed, right? But this is not allowed, that when the primary thing is being returned, to have multiple elements, that is to have multiple root elements, so to speak, right? So that is not allowed. There should be a single root element that is the structure of a tree that needs to be followed, right? So with that in mind, we have everything set up here. Now we can start writing some of our own code here in order to make things look a little bit more, how should I put it? To get some idea as to how to write this code, right? So now that we know what we are dealing with, we can clean up this project directory a little bit, because we don't need half of these boilerplate files that has been generated. So first and foremost, I don't need this favorite icon, so I'm just going to delete this. Okay, I don't need this logo.png file, so I'm going to delete this as well. I don't need this file either, so I'm going to delete this. I don't need the manifest.json, but I can keep this, and then robots.txt, I don't need this. I can essentially remove this. Within the SRC, I need the app.css, I can keep it for now. I need the app.js. I don't need the app test.js. We don't need this essentially, so we can remove this. We can remove the logo.svg file, which is some media file. We don't need the report vitals.js. We don't need the setup test.js either. Okay, so if we look into this, essentially this is what our project setup or our project directory is essentially going to look like. Okay, and then index.css file, and then app.css file. There is one thing that you have to keep in mind, or not one thing that you have to keep in mind, but you essentially can write your CSS just the same way that you have learned CSS. You can simply write it in these CSS files. You don't have to worry about it. The only difference is that instead of linking these CSS files directly with our HTML file, what we are doing is we are writing it as an import statement in the different JavaScript or JSX files that we are trying to connect the CSS with. And that's how we are implementing our CSS, right? So we take care of all of these different files. Index.html, we can leave it as such. I'm hoping that I have not destroyed any of the linking. It will complain a little bit, but we can kind of remove that to make sure we are not using any of the files that we deleted, right? So we don't need this link file because it is referring to an icon, and it is referring to the favicon.ico file, which we just removed. Okay. And then viewport, theme color, we can leave it as such. Description, we can leave it as such. We don't need this logo either. We just remove this logo. So this will give us an error. And let us not use the manifest file either. We don't need this. Title, we can just keep it as such. You can change it. No script. If the browser has an extension that has disabled scripting, then your JSX-based or your React.js-based UI will not render at all. Okay, so that's why we have this supplementary tag here, which is a no script tag. That is, in case the client has disabled JavaScript access on their browser, then this is the message that will be shown to them, right? And then we have this div ID root. We will keep it as such, and then we can remove all these boiler templates here. We don't need all of this information. Okay, and then essentially once that is set up, we have cleaned up our HTML file more or less. So you can clean up these comments as well, but I'll just leave it here in case you guys wanted to read what is going on, or you can read it on your side to get an idea of what is happening. Okay, then we come back to the index.js, which is going to be the landing page. So everything kind of looks good here for now. Yeah, we must make sure that you remove this report vitals because we have deleted that file. We are not going to be calling it. If you still have this, you're going to get an error. So I'm just going to remove the entirety of this thing here because we don't need any of this stuff right now. We are not looking into performance. Everything else looks good. Okay, so the last thing we will come to app.js. And then we have all of this code information. We don't need all of this information. So all we are going to do is we're going to retain the class name app here just in case, but we're going to replace this with our own code. Okay. So that is going to be an H1 tag, and we can say this is our custom app component. Okay, so what we can do here is let us create a little bit more and not just a single app component, because we already have seen how that essentially works. So let us work towards creating our first custom component. So what I'm going to do is inside this SRC folder, I'm going to create a subfolder here in order to kind of organize all of our custom defined components. So the name of that directory is going to be components itself, right? So you can see here, basically the material UI icons that we have installed as an extension to VS Studio Code kind of understands what we are trying to develop here. So inside the component, I'm going to, let's say, create a new file here. And this new file, we can give it some sort of name. Let's say we give it something along the lines of, let's say, what should we do? Let's for now keep it as simple as navbar.js. Now, in some projects, you will see that people, instead of using the JS extension, they use the JSX extension itself, right? So that is absolutely fine. There's not going to be much difference with respect to that, okay? With respect to the type itself, okay? So here, the first thing that I kind of always do is basically I import the React library, just in case we are using any kind of React components in our pages. You can leave this empty if you're absolutely sure you're not using any React component. But if you are, the first statement is to basically import React from React library itself, right? So please make sure while working with your React project, you have this extensions enabled. So if you search for this particular extension, which is the ES7 plus for library support for React, Redux, and then React Native. So all of the different things that we are going to be covering, it provides us with code completion support for these different elements, right? So please make sure that is there. That will help you with the code completion prompts that we are getting. Okay, so not React Native, but React functional component export. So what you have to write after that, whenever you create a particular custom component of yourself, is given that you have that extension enabled, if you write React RFCE, then what this stands for is basically a React functional export component. So remember, we talked about all of these different steps that we have to carry out for each file, right? So we have to kind of import any packages that we need. Then we have to declare the component. Inside the component, you will have a return statement, and then you will have an export statement. So instead of you writing it out step by step, all of these different aspects for setting up the boilerplate for any custom component file, if you have that extension set up, then you need to type React functional component export, okay, or RFCE. So if you do that, it again brings back the package because it takes care of that as well. So you can see here, we didn't have to write any of the, aspects that we just talked about, right? The boilerplate can be generated if you have that extension installed. This is a very useful extension. So please make sure you set it up in case you haven't done so already for your particular file, right? Just to give you a quick peek ahead, when you write it for React Native, so instead of doing React functional component export, you're going to do React Native functional component export. And there is a style component, which is different. We're not going to go there, but basically for React Native, the shortcut is RNFE to generate the boilerplate. And if you're working with a simple React project, then the shorthand is basically RFCE. So if you basically write RFCE and enter, then essentially it is going to take care of the 4 different steps. That is import packages, declare your function, have your return statement, and then export the function. So all of it will be taken care of by the extension itself, right? So it's a very useful extension, right? So notice here that if you have a single JSX statement within your return component, you kind of lose the first brackets. So essentially what you want to do is kind of put some more code here so that it does not removes the functional component. So here I can say something along the lines of within this div, I can write, let's say, an H1 component or an H2 component, and I can say this is the nav bar component. Okay, so now you can have the return statement as is. Okay, so after that, if we go back here, so now we have app.js. So there are two options that you have at this point of time of where you can import or recall these different functional components. So I can either put the navbar back into my app.js. So the way I would want to do so. So here we are not using this logo. So let us remove this logo. We're still using at least some portions of the CSS file, but I believe the CSS file is broken at this point of time. But anyways, so what we want to do is essentially we want to import into an object in this file that we call as navbar. So the moment we write navbar, VS Code project setup essentially understands the file that you are trying to import. So the moment I write the same name as the file name that I'm trying to import, it will connect. If it doesn't connect, then you need to basically write out the entire path name here, right? So what I need to do now is make a function call here. And remember, each return statement returns a single parent element. So before this H1, maybe what I can do is I can do a function call to my navbar. So essentially, I will make a function call here itself, right? So what I'm doing here is I'm saying that, hey, first render out this custom component that I have developed in a different file altogether, and then render whatever is there. And we take this and we punch it in the index.js file. Now, you did have the option to kind of call navbar here itself as well, right before probably the app functional call. But in case you do that, you will have to essentially wrap this whole thing inside a div container to make sure that this return statement is sending back one single element itself, right? So the next thing that you essentially have to do is run your project, right? So in order to run your project, you have to make sure that you are in the directory where you have all your files. So for me, this is the my app directory, right? So whatever name that you have given for your application, that is going to be the name of your directory. But essentially what I'm getting at is that you have to ensure that you are inside this particular directory, which consists of the scripts. The next thing is React.js setup comes with its own local server where you can test it, okay, while you're developing it. And in order to run that server, essentially all you have to do is call this script, which is npm start. And in the scripting in package.json, there's declaration of the actual command of what will happen if npm start is called. So all I have to do is, you can see here that I'm not inside my my app directory. You can see here that I'm inside the actual root directory, which is React demo. This is the directory that I'm in, right? But I need to move into demo2 and then into my app. So the first thing that I need to do is change my directory to demo2, okay, and then change my directory to my app. So once this is done, essentially now I am inside my project directory. So what I want to do next is basically start my local development server, right? So as you can see here, this is the entire command that is essentially executed when working with that server itself. Now, let me move this tab here. And now you can see here, this is our navbar component. So that is basically the custom component call that we did. So let me find you. Okay. So now if we go here and if we kind of compare this code to our stuff. So here we made a call to a different functional component. So that is being rendered first. And then we made a call to our H1 component, which is a part of the functional component of app.js. So that is what we are seeing here, right? And then we took this entire functional component and then we rendered it with the root element that is connected to the HTML file. And then that is basically anchored at that particular root element, right? So now essentially, if you take the entirety of this particular page, right? If I do this, if I do F12, what you can see here is that my entire project is just a div element, right? So you need to kind of expand that to see what is inside. You basically have a functional call to the app element. And then if you extend that, you see there is another div, which is holding on to our app, your navbar element, but you don't see the function call to that custom defined element. So that is the beauty of it, is that people don't necessarily understand how internally you have set it up. As a developer, you have control over what you are doing, right? So to kind of summarize all that we just talked about, everything in React is defined as a functional component, okay, with the development that you're doing. So that is the first thing that you have to remember. When you're writing a function, when you're defining the function, make sure that you name the functional file with a capital letter, and you name the name of the function itself with a capital letter. Okay, so that is the first thing that you have to remember. Within the function, that's JavaScript code, but inside the function, there is a return statement. And within the return statement is we write the JSX code, it's HTML-like code that will be rendered on the browser. Okay, while doing so, be careful about not using any reserved keywords. Please make sure you avoid that. And please make sure that each return statement returns a single parent element. That is the important thing that you have to remember. And then finally, don't forget this export statement. If you forget this export statement, then you cannot call these functional components in a separate file, right? You cannot essentially use that. So once you set this up, you put them all together, you pass it to the index.js file. The index.js file creates what we call as the React DOM root element by connecting to the primary root element that you have in your HTML file, and then makes a call to the functional component that needs to be rendered. Okay, so you can have one functional component call, you can have multiple functional component call. If you have multiple, please wrap it with a div element so that overall you just have a single parent. Okay, and then you have the index.html file. The body of that is basically a single line of code, which is basically a div container with the ID of a root. Okay, you can give any different ID that you want, but with respect to the technicalities, this ID is going to act as the root element. So that is why we use this kind of keyword to make the documentation a little bit straightforward to understand as to what this file is. Right? So does everybody follow what we are talking about? Does everybody have an understanding of the basic setup and the different files and the basic syntaxes that is necessary to kind of transform a code to React?
So far, yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right. So now we can move on to working with something a little bit more complex than, straightforward. But what you can try as a self-exercise is you can take any of the previous, not the quiz app or the calculator app. That will be a little bit difficult because we have not covered everything. But what you can do is, as a self-exercise, you can create the portfolio website again that we talked about at the very initial days in our HTML, CSS development, right? And what you can do is identify the different aspects of the website, right? And break it down into different components, right? So maybe you have one page, let's say you have 5 different pages, right? So instead of creating 5 different pages, you create a project which has a single page view. That is the keyword here, that the projects that you develop or the web interfaces that you're going to be developing with React.js, they follow this style, which is known as single page view. So even though if you have a navigation bar to multiple pages later on, I will show you using what we call as another library that is known as the React router. The web browsers, when you look at your web app or your website on the web browser itself, it feels as if the page never reloads. It feels as if you are on a single page, even if you have a menu, even if you have a navigation element present here. So before we go to React router, what you do is you transform your portfolio page into a single page view. Right? I believe some of you might have come across portfolio pages, which is like a long scrolling page, right? Which has different components as you scroll down. So what I want you to try out to get a little bit more confident with this is understanding this basic structure, recreate your portfolio website. But what you do is you take the different components of your portfolio website and define it as your custom components. So you can have the navbar component, and then you can have other components such as CV or personal information or hobbies information, all the different pages that you had. Just put that as different functional components, make a call to that functional component like we did here. So you will have navbar, and after that, you can have the next page, whatever that next page is, and you can continue to do so. And then see if you can run a React.js developed portfolio website. Okay, again, I hope the directive is clear. Convert all of the different pages that you have in your HTML project into individual functional components for the React project. So that means if you have a navbar, you create one functional component for that. If you have a separate page that you did in your HTML project for your CV, your resume, then create a functional component for that. If you have a hobbies page or a project description page in your CV, then create a functional component for that. Take all the code in that functional, in that particular project, put it inside the return statement, be aware of any kind of reserved keywords, and then make a functional call within app.js in a sequential fashion as to how you would like it to be rendered, and then create the project. So please try that out and see how that turns out. And hopefully you will be able to work that out, right? Or do you want to do it now and kind of move on to a little bit more complex example after we understand a little bit more of the basics? What is it that you want to do?
I'd kind of like to do that now.
Okay. All right, so let's try that out. Let's save this and let me identify a project from our directory, which we can take as a boilerplate example that we can use in order to develop our demo application. Okay, so let me see here. There should be an example of a full-fledged clone application that I did, which also has the CSS file. Okay, let me see here. Where's my navbar example? Navbar. Okay, we don't have any navbar, so let's just ignore that and let's just create the setup here itself and just talk about it again. So we have the navbar already set up, and what should we have after the navbar? We have to talk a little bit about the design right now, since we don't have one with us. So portfolio page with React.js. Okay, so all we have to do, we are not creating the navigation bar as such. That is, we are not implementing React router. That is a little bit of a complex, not complex, but a little bit of an intermediate technology. We need to understand props and all before we get to that point. So let us just discuss the fact that, okay, we do have a navbar, which is basically non-functional for the time being. We're just going to keep this non-functional. Okay, but we will just import it as a different component, and we will keep it as a placeholder in order to work with it. And maybe in the next class, we can work with React router directly. Maybe we will see about that, right? After that, let's say we have what we call as the hero component. Hero component is basically like when you are on the landing page, right? You give some information about what the content of the page is going to be all about, right? So it's front and center, and it kind of gives you an idea about what you are trying to do. So let me just see if I can find an example. Airbnb online experiences. Okay, let's see. Okay, so if you look at this Airbnb page here, right? So this is what we call as the hero component, right? So it kind of gives you an idea of some of the immediate information that you want your client's attention to be drawn to, or that you want your users' attention to be drawn to. And after that, you have the main page, which consists of these different card components. We call these as card components. And all of these, you can see these are all different card components with different information that is kind of inserted into it, right? So what we can do for a portfolio website is once the navigation information is done, we can basically create our hero component here. And essentially the hero component for a portfolio page is going to be who you are, what you do, any quirky fact or information about you. So you will put that information there. Once that hero component is done, what is the next thing that you would like to highlight here in your main body? Let's say you want to give some sort of project descriptions, some of the highlighting of your project or your skill set codes, something along those lines that you have worked with. Maybe you want to give some kind of hobbies information. And then finally, let's say you want to wrap up your single page view with a contact information, right? As to how you would like to be contacted and stuff like that. So once you have understood the design, that is the first step, is to kind of break down your page and to understand what are the different design aspects, right? The fun thing that we are going to be doing maybe after this is we will connect this nav bar to these different components in the single page, right? So what will happen is that you will have a page scroll view that if you click the nav bar, oh, I don't want to know about I just want to contact you. I have some information. So instead of scrolling down, if I click on the nav bar to contact, then it will just scroll down to contact itself, right? So we will do like a single page navigation, so to speak. You can do multi-page navigation using React Router, but it is going to have a fun behavior, right? Compared to your traditional HTML pages, but we will get to that eventually. So once the design setup is done, let us just create a component file for each of these different components that we have talked about. So again, remember, React is composable. So that means we have to identify what are the different components of every page, right? Not just your entire project, but you have to think in terms of, okay, each page that will be rendered and shown to the user, what are the different components in that? And we have to break it down. And eventually what will happen if there is a different page that we have on our project, and that also needs the nav bar, I don't have to write the nav bar twice. I'll just make a function call to wherever the nav bar is, and I will just tweak the connectivities of the path and stuff like that in order to set it up, right? So the second step that we will do after our design step is for each component, we are going to create a file within this component's subdirectory, right? So I already have navbar created. So let me go ahead and create my hero. Okay, so I'm just going to write hero.js. And then what else did we have? Then we have projects. So we can say something like projects.js. Okay. And then what else do we have? Let's say we have hobbies and then we have contact. Okay, so here I'm just going to create two more components. So hobbies, and remember the file name starts with the capital letter. So hobbies.js, and then finally we have contact.js. All component names must start with a capital letter. That is basically how we work with this particular code, right? So that is what you have to remember. All right. So now, once you have created each of your component file by giving it a name, the next step that you should do, or for beginner, as a beginner, is to populate some boiler code in each of these different component files that we have generated, right? So I'm just going to go to contact whatever I see here, one after the other, and I'm just going to generate the boiler code, right? So I'm just going to write React functional component export, okay? And then click enter, all right? Or then hit enter. It will just create the entirety of this. And then I will save it. Okay, it will break this return statement. I kind of don't like this about Prettier doing this all the time, but hey, we have to deal with this. So essentially, maybe what we will do is not save this for the next ones, eventual ones. All right. So next, after contact, we go to hero.js, do the same thing, React functional component export, RFCE, all right, and then hit enter. Okay, don't save this time, otherwise it will break here. Next, hobbies, React functional component export. Okay, hobbies done. Navbar was already done. and then project.js, React functional component export, enter, and then this is ready as well. All right. So the next thing that we want to do is this div says project, blah, blah, blah. Maybe what we want to do is just hit an enter here and then just put a h4 tag. For some reason, I just decided to go with h4. And then this is what we can say is that test projects component, right? So just put some code here for a sanity check so that we can kind of make sure that all our component is connected across each other and the whole project setup is ready. So before you start working on the actual content itself, set up your project, right? And double check that your project is actually rendering. So now if you put any kind of information there, you know it will work, right? There is nothing wrong with the setup. So we don't have to debug that part, right? So here, I'm just going to copy this and move back one after the other. So navbar is already set up here. And then inside of hobbies, we're just going to put a statement here. Okay. And then I particularly missed the first bracket here. So that is throwing me an error. So I'm just going to copy this. Go to projects, that is done. Go to hero component. So I'm just going to put this statement here as well. What else? So contact, this is missing. So put this here. The reason why I'm doing this additional step is because otherwise this prettier extension will remove the first brackets and I have to go back and put it again. I kind of don't like that one. So anyways, just save all of this once you have inserted that information. Okay, and all export statements are ready. And then we go to app.js, which is going to be the congregation or kind of bringing together of all of the different components as we would like to render it on the web page, so that we don't have to touch the setup of index.js file. We can just keep it. Sometimes you will see that people kind of ignore this app.js and they kind of put everything inside index.js. But for large projects where you have a ton of components, I would not recommend that. I would just tell you to connect it and make sure you keep your landing page kind of clean to understand what is your primary application. So the entire application logic, I like to kind of put it and consolidate that inside app.js itself. All right. So now once this is ready, inside of app.js, my first step is to import all of these different files. So we have already done for navbar. So let us just go ahead and start importing one by one all of the different components that we have. So I can see here contact. Okay. And then I can see, what can I see? I can see hero. And then, whoops. Then I can see an import for hobbies. Okay. And then finally, I believe finally, there should be one for projects. Okay. All right. So there is a warning, and essentially the warning is that we have kind of, imported all of these different components, but we are never using them in the project. So let us solve that problem. So we have this navbar element here. We have this h1 tag here. So once this h1 tag is done, what I'm going to do is start making a functional call in a sequential order of what I want to be displayed on the web page itself. So let's say after the navbar, the first thing that I want to display is but essentially a functional component call to my hero page. So this is the syntax for that. To make a functional call to a React component, this is how we do it, right? So this is the syntax. So once the hero is done, the next thing I want to show is basically my projects. Okay, close my functional component call. After projects, what is next? What do I want to show next is basically my hobbies. Okay, so again, following the same syntax, we put hobbies. And then finally, all I have is basically my contact. Okay, so I'll put the contact. And that's it, right? So my warning is gone. I don't have any errors. So we can go back to our page here and we can see everything is magically connected. So this is our navbar component. That's the function call to our navbar component. This is the H1 that we have in the app itself. So this is the H1 that you have in the app itself. Then you can see that these are all function calls. So that means when this is rendered, it actually goes to this piece of code here, looks at this return statement, takes whatever is here, and then renders that out on the web page. Okay, so essentially, I can ignore or I can remove these divs and I can just keep this H4. You cannot have any free floating text, by the way, inside these return statements because it will throw an error. It will try to understand whether this is JSX, JS, and it is neither, right? So it will be confused. So don't leave any free floating text. But if you had removed this text here, and if it was only an H4 tag, then you could have ignored the div here. But since I know that I will have multiple components, I'm just keeping this div for the time, right? So this is how you do a sanity check. And right now, all you have to do is basically find your portfolio code and start replacing these different components in these individual files with whatever code that you have, right? So, and that will start showing up, and CSS will make the presentation, will make up for the presentation, right? So I'm still trying to find that code that we did for our nav bar. If I can only find that, I can just quickly show you how it will look instead of having to type out everything. So maybe if we go to the CSS, and we can probably find it from there. No, unfortunately, it is not there. Is it here? Yeah, it's in the nav bar itself. But anyways, let us start putting in some information here and let us work with our hero element first, right? So what is it that we want to describe here? What is the content that we want to describe here? So in the content, we have an H1 already, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a section. Do we want to have a section here? We have to make some choices with respect to how we want to set up our HTML code or JSX code within this content. So maybe what we can do is we can keep a main tag here, or maybe we can ignore it, but we need a header. And the only header that we have not used at this point of time is basically an H2 header. So I'm going to delete all of this code. I'm going to put a H2 tag. Okay. And we can give something like, hello, my name is Dev. Okay. My name is Mr. Developer. All right. And then what other information do you want to give here? Let's say we give a subtitle here in form of an H3 tag. I am a full-time student at OU. Okay. And then I can give a P tag so that we don't keep on continuing working with our header tags. And we can say that I am currently a junior or a senior and am expected. I'm currently a junior majoring in CS or IT. Okay, and I'm expected to graduate in 2025, maybe like this, fall of 2025. Okay. Did I use anything that was not expected? All right. Okay, so we do this and we kind of go back to our browser to see that if the information is kind of inserted. Okay, and that is done. And whenever you want to kind of insert any kind of image, we have already seen that that code is also there for our hello world example. So we don't have to kind of, what we have to do is you put an image inside of this SRC folder. If you want to put it inside SRC folder, you can create a new subdirectory called media, or you can create a subdirectory called images. If you want to have the images sent to the client side for those images which can be public, then you can put it inside the public folder, right? And typically those images are like icon images and not typically your web browser images. So you can put the image here Currently, I don't have an image as such, so I'm just going to leave that empty for the time being. But we can insert that anytime that you want using the boiler code that you have, right? So is there any other piece of information that you would like to put in the introduction section? You have your name, you're a full-time student, what you're doing, anything else that seems relevant?
I think that's probably good.
Yeah, nothing else to do here. Okay. So again, please notice that I have multiple elements that are on the same level. Okay, but I'm returning a single element from this return statement. All right, so pretty straightforward here. And next we can move on to, let's say, our projects. That's the second thing that I want to kind of express here. So I'm going to clean up this thing here. All right, and then here what I can do is probably I can punch in a table. Okay, so I can do another, it's a section, and let's start from h2 tag itself. Just to projects highlights, right? And then we can give probably like a p tag, and then we can say here the following are the projects that highlights my skill set. Now what I'm doing now is basically using a component that we are already familiar with, right? But later on, what I'm going to do is I'm going to transform this into card components, right? So essentially, the way we have seen many of these existing websites express their information, we are going to set our projects component in that similar fashion itself, right? So what will happen there is that we will have a single piece of code here itself, but we will call that multiple times, like project with a new information, and it will be rendered out in order to show us how we are going to reuse the code here, right? Because what would have happened is that if we were doing regular HTML for this project's information, I would have had to repeat the information, right? Again and again. So what I'm trying to tell you is, let's say, if I want to not use, let's say, a tabular element, okay, and I just want to insert that information one by one, right? So maybe I can create like a div container, okay? So I can put a div, right? And maybe I can give it a class name later on if I need to apply CSS separately to this particular component. And I can say project description. Now, this is where React starts to pick up. I hope I spelled that correctly. Okay, so I create a container to wrap that entire project description all together. Let's say I use a h3 tag. Okay, and in the h3 tag, I can say the title of my project, and I can say XYZ project, right? And after the h3 tag, maybe I can put an h4 tag, and in the h4 tag, I can put the information about where this is. So location Z, something like this. And then maybe I can specify the title itself. So I can say something like junior web app developer. Okay. And then I can probably give the dates. So I can probably say 2020 to 2021. Okay. And then I can take this location, and then I can finally put that here in an h5 tag. I can set this up. So I can probably, well, where's my stuff? Okay, it's gone. So it's location Z. And then finally, I can have like a p tag here to give some description of my project. Okay, I think we will wrap this and create like a position for the next topic itself, because this is a good way to kind of begin that. So if we check here, so this is our project's highlight right now, right? If we add CSS here, it will start to look more and more presentable, but pay attention to what is happening here. So you have this project. I can put CSS to have a border around this whole thing until this point. Okay. So, but the thing is, let's say what would happen or how would you code this particular piece of setup if I have to give another project? So this is, let's say, XYZ project, and let's say now I have a ABC project, and then PQR project. Okay, so let's say I have two more projects where I have to provide the same pieces of information. That means I have to give it the title, what was my role, when did I work, like what was the duration of start and end date, where is it located, and then the description. So you can see that the structure of how you need to present your information is the same, and it needs to be repeated. But if right now, if I copy this container, which has my first project, and if I copy paste this and do it 2 more times for ABC and PQR, then that is going to be almost the same design as that of writing an HTML file. So why go through this additional headache of all these functional component calls and setting it up, all of these different directory structures? So what is the benefit? There has to be some sort of benefit that makes our life a little bit easier, right? And this is where the power of React is going to come into the picture, since we are defining these different components as function calls. You should also be aware from your prior knowledge about working with functional programming that we can provide parameters here. And then wherever the function call is being done, we can essentially make a call to the, or we can provide an argument to these different items, and we can set it up that way, right? So that means what I can do is I can take all of this information. So if you pay attention, this is a variable, right? So this information can be passed by the user. This is a variable as well, because this will change from time to time based on the project that you're trying to describe, right? This is a variable as well, okay? And then this is a variable as well, right? So all of these are different variables, and then we can set up parameters that will be receiving those variables. And then when we kind of call those parameters, or when we call this function, we can pass in the arguments that will be received by these parameters, and then the actual location will replace that information, and we can set up a very customized way of working with this, right? So what we are going to do is essentially, in order to set up that props, what we call it as props, right? So the parameters of our functional components, we call it as props. It's a shorthand for properties, but we always call it props. We don't say properties in completion as such, right? So we are going to pass in it as an object, right? We do have the capability to, independently declare all of these different parameters. So let us put some more context to this so that we understand what we are doing. So here we will have a role, okay? And then maybe we can just keep it here. We can say dates. Be careful with this, because dates, there's also a library here that allows us to take the dates. And then let's say here we have a location, and let's put a more valued location. And then we can say here description. Okay, some of the description that we are working with. So what will happen is that if we set up the parameter props here, depending on the values that are being passed from the function call, this object will receive all of those values, right? So we can name these values whatever that you want to provide here, right? Whatever name that you want to provide for these different parameters, you can provide that, right? And you can use that same name. And remember, this is an object. So that means if the object has different keys, then what I can do is I can call props dot title, if title is what I have passed on to this when I am working with this particular component itself, right? So this way I can set things up. All right. So what I can do separately, maybe I should have done a separate file there, because here I will have to hard code my data. Okay, let's do it step by step so you understand. All right. So let's save this. All right, no problems here, but we need to kind of go back to wherever we have this functional component call here. And what we need to do is whenever we have these projects, right, then we have to one by one pass in the information that essentially is going to be there for our projects. So the easiest way to go about this is to set up our object, which we can do here at the beginning, or we can do it as a separate file and then import that object altogether. So what we can do is we can create an array of objects, or we can create an object for, let us do it in a simple way. So object for project descriptions. All right. So essentially what I'm trying to do here is basically, let's say, create an object for, let's say, project one. You can create it as an array of objects and put everything into a single, under a single roof. All right. And then object is basically curly brackets. Array is our third bracket. And then I can give here, let's say, title. Okay. And then, whoa, not this. Okay. And then the title is essentially going to be a string, and I will say X, Y, Z project. Okay. And then we can keep the comma. Essentially, I think we need this. All right. So once we set this up, what we can do here is when we call this project's information here, I just showed you one, everything else will kind of work out similarly. So what we are going to do here is we are going to write title equals, and then we can refer to wherever the information's typically in a full-fledged project. This is going to come from a backend, from a database, right? But essentially, when it comes from a database, when you make that database call, you're going to save it in some object, or you're going to save it in some array temporarily. You can do that, right? So think about it this way, that after a database call here, I brought in that information and I stored it in this object. And I'm just showing you for one of the variables. You can do it for all of the variables in a similar fashion. So what I do here is I take the title, then I wrap it inside curly braces. So remember again, within the return statement, if I wrap any code using these curly braces, essentially I can write JavaScript there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this object name, okay, and I'm going to use the dot operator to refer to the key value of the title that we are going to use. So essentially, once you set it up in this way, I am passing a value to the function call. Okay, so that means now inside projects.js, here, instead of writing your title is this, I'm going to replace this. I'm going to again wrap it in curly braces because it's going to be a JavaScript code. I'm going to embed the value. I'm going to take props dot, and then I'm going to make title. All right. This is how I'm going to replace the value that is going to come from my stuff there. So you can see here the title still says XYZ project, but I will show you a fun part that will happen right now. Is now, let's say we go back to app.js, we create another object here, and let's say we call it project2. Okay. Remember, you can bring these together into a single array, but I have to take another step to extract it from the array itself. So I'm avoiding that for the time being. And I can do the same thing. So I can do the title, and I can say the title is, let's say, DEF project. So now, instead of writing this whole component one by one again, as we have it here, all I need to do is go back to my app.js, come here, copy this guy, okay, and call this function again. But instead of passing project1.title, I'm going to pass project2.title, right? So this way, if we go back and revisit here, you can see that without having to write, so we will do the same thing for the other variables as well, but you can see here that I didn't have to write the whole code again, because if I set up the skeleton structure of my individual code, then I can recall it again and again. So that is the reusability part. That is the motivation again. So remember, the way we can make our React.js codes reusable is through the help of what we call as props. Okay, we can use that name itself. Here, it's an object. You can destructure this object if you directly want to use the title itself. You can read it up if you don't remember how we work with destructuring. But essentially, what destructuring will do is if I do something like this, title, okay, and if I assign this to my props itself, then this will essentially allow you to kind of destructure or use the key member that is present in the object itself with it, right? But if you do not want to do that, if you have like smaller object sizes and stuff like that, then you can essentially do object dot title in order to kind of access that value, right? So I hope everybody understands this is how the websites are actually reducing the amount of code that you have to write by kind of doing this. So please try this as a self exercise. There are a few things that I would like you to do. So take this code that we have right now, okay? And what you can do is, first step, transform all of these variables into the similar structure that we did here. So that means you go to your app.js, populate more data members for these two objects, and then pass it one by one, okay? And then you will realize that if you keep on doing it, then essentially you will have a lot of arguments here, right? So that means you will have title, you will have the location, your job description, start date, end date, description. So that's a lot of arguments, right? So how can you improve that code, right? How can you make it a little bit more cleaner when you're trying to make that function call, right? So first of all, practice. That's the first thing. Make sure that you understand how these props work. How do you make your React code reusable? That is necessary. And then the second thing that you can try out is take all of these individual objects that we have set up, put it inside an array, and then loop over the array. And then for each iteration, make a functional call. So automate the process. So instead of having to write this 5 times or 6 times or how many number of times, make this automated as well. So that means you have to run it inside a for loop, and the for loop will do the function call for you. And every time there is a new iteration of the for loop, you will design your code in such a way that you use the correct index of the array and pass those values as arguments. So that way, I don't have to write these multiple times. So I hope you understand this. Try it. And we are going to continue in the next class from this point and make it more robust, right? And we will use this as a segue to move into Airbnb clone, which kind of has a similar structure. And we will talk about all these different components, right? We'll discuss a little bit more about props, all right? So to wrap up today's class and to kind of look into the takeaways, we talked about the setup of React.js project folder. Again, we talked about the important steps to take at the beginning when you are starting to work with your React.js stuff. We talked about how to declare your custom components, what custom components are, how to declare custom components, and then how to execute or call your custom components. And then we had an introduction into understanding what are props in React.js and how to set up your code using props itself, right? So I just gave you a glimpse of what needs to be done. What is necessary for those who are learning for the first time is to practice, to get comfortable, right? To kind of overcome that hump where you feel you have this little bit of uncertainty and anxiety working with a new technology, which you can only overcome if you make sure that you practice, okay, and not just listen, right? So I'll wrap up here and take any questions that you may have. And if there are no questions, then we're done for today. And I will all see you again on Thursday online. Thank you.
I had a question.